Okay, I think we can start. The program is rather dense, so we should better be on time. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce yet another speaker. Yesterday afternoon I promised that would be my last introduction. It's not the case. Apparently all my colleagues in the organization committee decided that I'm the oldest one, so I have to make all the introductions, but still fine, no big problem, because also it's always a pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers. And this morning we are pleased to have Professor Sean Cubitt from Goldsmiths, University of London, and his contribution confirms the cross-disciplinary nature of this event. In fact, he's not really a technologist, but a colleague who studies technology from a different perspective. And he's a professor of media studies, and I'm really eager to see what he's going to tell us about ecologies in the mass image. Thank you very much.
Buongiorno a tutti. My apologies for speaking in English. So I know it's 9:30 and pictures of Justin Bieber are probably the last thing you want to see, but like every snapshot, a portrait photograph, especially the most informal, is torn out of the continuum. It's isolated, immobilized, and to that extent, it's traumatic. Selfies are a special instance of this trauma. The selfie is a truly new phenomenon in mass media, especially mass photography. It coincides, not at all coincidentally, with a crisis, a mass epidemic in mental health. A crisis of the self in the digital age. The performance of the self to camera is an effort to guarantee that the self exists, because the self that is captured is no longer guaranteed by social or psychological validations. As a social construct and as a psychological underpinning, the self at our moment in history is vanishing, and it's being replaced by behaviors, which are the things that many of you measure. Swipes, likes, tags, geolocation, URL, device IDs, credit card and search history, all the relations we have reinforced or allowed to wither on social media, all the foam that we leave behind us in our digital wake. Behaviors identify each of us to the domains that we traverse, but they're insufficient to identify us to ourselves, which is why selfies become important. Even though we intend each selfie to witness the existence of self, instead it gives evidence of the self only in the moment of its vanishing. At the same time, a selfie is only a clutch of code unless it's published. And publication is also an act of generosity. Even at its most narcissistic, a selfie fails to give an identified self back to a decreasingly self-assured, increasingly anonymous self. In an also poetic feedback loop of behavior, but it's also, in its publication, a gift to an equally anonymous, imaginary, and disappearing social whole. So, what's particularly ironic is that the gift is given in a form that can only be properly read by a computer. From the point of view of a suffering self, it's a minor concern that the gift is stolen for profit by massive data harvesting corporations, but it is the case. It's tempting to see the selfie as an allegory. Allegories typically stand in for something that's too abstract to be photographed or otherwise depicted. In late medieval and early Renaissance allegories, audiences could be relied on to recognize key icons and emblems, standing for an idea like hope or fame, An anchor meant hope, just as the Selva Oscura and the opening lines of the Divina Commedia meant the forest of sin and mortality. Everybody knew. But allegories articulate also pictures and words. A picture of an anchor means the word hope. That remains a resource every time we see words and pictures together, as in this 1979 image from a street in London's Soho. That graffiti remained there for years. It's over a hot air duct from local restaurants that homeless people would sleep on because it was warm. And someone had written "burnt out stars" as an allegory everyone understood in Thatcher's Britain. Already by the Baroque, common agreement on the meaning of emblems had begun to splinter along religious lines. The last hurrah of allegory occurs in the 19th century, confronting itself with a phenomenon whose scale and nature defied any of the old regimes of imaging. But it was unready yet to move towards another mode of visualizing the global reach of economy, power, and communication. So this commemorative bronze medal was struck in 1866 by the Paris Mint to celebrate the first meeting of the International Telecommunications Union. Then it was still the Telegraph Union. It's the oldest international body in the world, and still, for many of our purposes, one of the most significant. In 1866, a group of extremely bearded gentlemen gathered together and chose a female symbol for this enterprise on which they had engaged to establish the rules for international trade in telecom. A female figure between two brigade telegraph terminals, surrounded by a motto that I suppose many of you probably know more Latin than I do, but it reads roughly, voice signaled by hand encircles the world. Now there are some problems about this particular image. The personification of the telegraph, or maybe the Union, is winged, but not at the heels like Mercury, but at the shoulders like an angel, which is a messenger of God, or a messenger between incommensurable worlds, the divine and the human. Angels are also sexless beings, and here we have gendered creature, even in the place of a sexless theology of communication, which was expressed by the ITU in its first formations. Now, the figure could be Vox, because Vox is a feminine noun. But then it might, that's a problem because until much later, voice was not transmitted by by telegraph. So that would explain the prominence of her hands in the image. But then she appears to be both the receiver and the sender. So is she the message voice being transmitted between the telegraphs? Or possibly the channel, the telegraph? It's extremely unclear. We do appear to have a loop closed by a non-human angelic messenger from another world. It's a failed diagram, as it were, of a new communication system that these people were alone in understanding but could find no other way of communicating to their audiences. Now, the failure of allegory can be read in two directions. One of them concerns the truth of images, and the other the translations between words and images. In one, we demand truth of images as never before. In the ancient times before Plato, images were both powerful and dangerous, and they could transfer power from invisible to visible domains. Plato distrusted images, as did the religions of the book. And Plato severed even the residual relationship with truth the Bible had when it banned images because they showed untruth. But even untruth was not fair enough for Plato. It was only with the invention of photography that a new kind of empirical truth began to be ascribed to images. As a direct result, the residual truth claims of allegory became first garbled and then stupid. And we very rarely see allegories being used nowadays, except for comedy. Allegory became impossible partly because the cultural unity that allowed direct translation between text and image was shattered by the invention of photography. As soon as photography announced itself as the pencil of nature, in Fox Talbot's phrase, a direct transcription of the real world onto a pictorial surface, not only the status of allegory, but the status of words began to slip. The media philosopher Wilhelm Flusser argues an opposite case, that the technical image, his word for photography, film, television, video, and all our subsequent media, the technical image brokers a new compact between images and text, directly opposed to the hypothesis I've just offered. Photographs, says Flusser, would henceforth be channels for conveying textual messages, a trend completed in the digital image. Now, this is true in the sense that photographs only appear to be like paintings and drawings. The technical reality underneath appearance is an ontological stratum of code. We all know this, it's straightforward. Each subpixel, every picture is a mere expression. Code is really real. Images are merely outward appearances, they are representations. Each subpixel of a CCD or CMOS chip averages the numbers and wavelengths of the photons that arrive at it during the period of exposure, converting them into a charge and sending them on to be digitized. The truth of digital photography, which is not so different from chemical photography, but is in certain key ways, is that the key difference, in fact, is that the spatter of light-sensitive molecules on a piece of photographic emulsion in chemical photography is random. But the grid that controls the gathering of light in a digital image is a highly rigid organization of the light-sensitive materials. Otherwise, the difference is only that in chemical photography, we throw away the electrons that result from the chemical reaction. And in digital photography, we keep the electrons. Yeah, it's the only difference. Latency is the same, etc. So, the correlates of this mathematical inscription of the physical world is the belief that the world itself is mathematical. For a certain kind of science, a certain dominant conception of data, the world already gives itself in numbers. Camera chips are designed on this model with a particular limitation that in order to digitize the incoming information, all quantities have to be whole numbers in order to be digitized. The averaging process requires both discarding anomalies and rounding up or down to fit the binary frame. This operation occurs first at the subpixel scale of microlenses, Bayer masks, and receptors. It's confirmed by the subordination of the field of view to the pixel grid and by the application of a digital clock to the process of draining the resulting charge from the chip and into storage. It happens again in compression and decompression, where the application of Fourier and discrete cosine transforms and Huffman coding are among the algebraic functions applied to demonstrate the wholly mathematical nature of the coded entities throughout their processing and transmission at display. That coding and those processes underlie but escape human perception. They also inherit a radically new conception of time, which requires a little bit of history to make sense of. So for 3 centuries, perspective dominated visual culture. In painting, in the far more widespread culture of prints and engravings, and in the fundamental design of optical lenses for photography. But around the year 1800, a new system for visual display appeared. incorporating a rapidly expanding vocabulary of bar charts, pie charts, linear diagrams, and critically for digital culture, the first use of the t-axis, the time axis along the bottom. This emerges 1796, depending exactly where you look. There's one or two earlier examples. Joseph Priestley's map of history, which includes his first, William Playfair's earliest statistical breviary, and this is a later edition of the statistical breviary. It's just a nicer picture. So, the new visual form came promptly to meet the explosion of statistics in the 19th century. Today we can scarcely imagine a scientific report, a policy document, or even a news broadcast that is not entirely dependent, or to a very great degree dependent, on visualizations of information of the kind that emerged only 200 years ago, but which are now so significant to our visual culture. Panofsky used the term symbolic form to describe perspectives, and subsequent authors have said that, for example, Cubism doesn't constitute a symbolic form because there is only a limited number of statements that can be made using the grammar of Cubism. But there is an infinite number of statements that can be made using data visualization tools, just as there are an infinite number of statements that can be made in perspective. It is that significant. In my own discipline of film studies, we're used to describing narrative and perspective illusions as dominant media. That's not the case. It's certainly no longer the case. The dominant media of our times, the media that are used in order to dominate, are spreadsheets, databases, and geographic information systems. So we have been wrong for about 30 odd years at least in saying that illusions and illusionistic media are the most important. Geographic information systems in particular show one of the great strengths. Cartography already had a 500-year history, but by the time GIS, geographic information systems, begin, they assimilate and repurpose cartography to fit the new regime of data visualization as a dominant form of media, and visual media in particular. And it's really clear that the dominant structure of the grids that begins perhaps with Mercator's projection is assimilated into data visualization from its birth and is now the great signifier of the control of both light, as I hope I just demonstrated, and of information in the 21st century. In exactly the same way that map making has been assimilated, contemporary digital photography is also a data visualization. Like the faint object camera aboard the Hubble Space Telescope, which scanned this image of the surface of Pluto over a series of observations during 1994. Every sub-pixel in a CCD is effectively a photon counter. That's what the FOC is, the faint object camera. It counts individual photons arriving from very dim and distant points in the universe. It numbers the incoming quanta, translating their accumulation into charge that can be decoded as luminosity. But decoding is not an essential aspect of the work of a photon counter, whose name reveals that its real job is accumulating numbers. A CCD is not restricted to the narrow spectrum visible to the human eye. In fact, it cannot see in any humanly recognizable way at all. We associate the gathered numbers with vision, but they appear to the CCD only as pulses structured by pre-planned procedures. The photon counter converts contingent inputs into usable patterns. It converts noise into data. It's a real lesson about how instruments of all kinds, including cameras, observe. From whole number encoding to instructions on how to be read by other devices and operating systems so that they all abide by a universal system, the order of controlled light is based on the grid, that great signifier of modernity, from urban planning to plaid shirts. In the history of aesthetics, an image is considered a self-sufficient whole But digital photographs are designed to be disassembled for transmission, as I'm sure we're all aware, in packet switching networks. Now, despite its name, the TTL segment at the end, the time to live, is not a measure of time. It defines a maximum number of nodes that a packet can pass through before it is erased, so as not to choke the system. It is, in fact, then not a temporal but a topological measure. That's a second point I want to make about information visioning. It's reliant on the abstract graph of network connections, like a map of rail connections at the Rome network, rail network, or the submarine cable map that I've put here. You'll see that on this map, political divisions are actually marked they're probably a bit faint from where you're sitting, but they've marked political divisions very clearly. They mark coastlines very clearly. But the actual submarine cables are not shown at all in any of the physical detail of where they lay. They are simply shown as topological connections between nodal points, like Taiwan here, or the transatlantic nodes. This is interesting partly from an ecological point of view, because nobody ever recovers used dark fibre, much of which was laid before the Montreal Protocols and is full of PCBs that were banned in Montreal. They are lying at the bottom of the ocean. Nobody knows the chemistry of plastics at those depths, at those levels of salinity, under those conditions of pressure. Nobody knows, and yet 276 million kilometers of new fibre are laid a year. Of course, that's individual fibres, and they're bundled in 200, 300 multiplex cables. But that is a vast amount of purified glass. The purification process itself is a frighteningly ecologically dangerous thing. And then anything that is left over, wrapped in plastics, whose chemistry we scarcely know, connected by magnetic routers whose effect on magnetically sensitive marine life, such as sharks, we are beginning to understand, and it's highly negative. But nobody ever picks up the trash, and our maps do not even bother saying where the trash is. That's the significance of a topological map. It is an exclusion of noise. It excludes unwanted information. So, okay. So, topology plus the grid produces a universal system of which the Catholic Church in the Baroque period would have been proud. It is total, it is universal, it aspires to completion, it aspires to complete coherence. So what makes this universality so convincing? It is taken from the material ecology, the founding principle that everything mediates everything else. Just as the individual life of this or that microbe is insignificant compared to the complexity of an ecology, so the existence of this or that piece of data or this or that user is insignificant to the total complexity of the system in which they're embedded. So, rather absurdly, given the proliferation of images, this mass image that is being produced by our group efforts of taking photographs, this is a result of a search for this faculty at Roma Tre. So strictly speaking, the mass image is invisible. Now, although all of these appeared in a search I did a few days ago for Ingegno Roma Tre, so we have here a mass aggregation of images collected in the corporate databases of Google, Facebook, Instagram, Weibo, Baidu, and the others, complete with their metadata. To exist, an image must be discoverable. It has to be published. For that, it has to be incorporated in this kind of database. We retrieve some few images for care and attention. But at a conservative estimate last year, 30+ million images were uploaded to Twitter, 52 million to Instagram, 350 million to Facebook, totaling around 500,000 images were uploaded daily. We cannot possibly pay attention to that many images. Now, relational databases that treat like these also treat searches and interactions like shares and tags as additional data and construe new constellations of the image accordingly. All the metadata attached, geolocation, personal identifiers, device identifiers, date stamps, face recognition, etc., is all combined with data from searches, swipes, and likes. And they're clouds of information in constantly evolving organizational diagrams that only machines can read. So if you do this search, you will get a different set of images because this includes my search history and multiple search histories. And by the time you do the search, it will have changed because other people will have done the same search and found and influenced the ranking of the images. The mass image of the department emerges as an aggregate portrait made by thousands of donors to Google, which is busy training AIs to envision the world they are excluded from, but that they depend on as material entities. Any material entity depends on its environment, but this environment of the mass image is premised on its separation from the world that feeds it. Now, it's tending, I believe, towards a total portrait of the human environment. In many ways, a utopian project, if it weren't that none of us trust some of the major corporations with our data. At its first level, the one we can at least glimpse, if not really see, the mass image aspires to compose a total photographic and videographic image of the world. At a second level, this image is invisible because what I recorded with this screen grab yesterday will not repeat tomorrow, and you wouldn't see it the same way anyway. The mass image is made of individual images which appear to us, at least, as images, but appear to it merely as nodes of the relations, which is what it really is interested by. It's the relations in topologies we can vaguely intuit and whose properties we could derive from the algorithms if they were public, but which even then we wouldn't be able to see because software in operation, software in performance is not something that can actually be viewed physically by human viewers. So the significance now of the time axis becomes a little clearer. The date, it's a long way round to get back to this idea that there's a new form of time emerging. The date stamp on each image and relation is, as seen by a machine, a topological datum. It doesn't mark change. It merely is another signal, like a URL or like a piece of facial recognition. It is just a datum. It doesn't have a temporal dimension. Change is, for the database, a calculus of variations in an otherwise unchanging matrix. The mass image not only aspires to completion, it aspires to coherence. It wants to make a shadow ecology that represents the real ecology. The difference is that the real ecology is incomplete and incoherent. The mass image assimilates the new into unchanging stability, a homeostatic system. In this, it is modeled not on natural ecology, but on the imaginary neoliberal model of a market, which combines millions of transactions a second into a perfect equilibrium, the model of ordoliberalism and neoliberalism. The diagram of domination and exploitation in the market is entirely homeostatic. There's no subject of the mass image. There is an invisible hand. Yeah. Once we had science. Science was a large, collective, but still human operation that knew. So one scientist knew the microscopic anatomy of the whale, and another scientist knew the chemical composition of the rings of Saturn. But science knew all of these things and more. Science was the great subject, a collaborative project. Now I would say that science is being superseded by what some people call a marketplace of ideas, but what seems to me increasingly to be a non-human knower of all knowledge. The one we refer to when, instead of asking somebody on the street which way to go to find our destination, we look at Google Maps. Because we don't know anymore. The subject of knowledge is a database. The subject that knows. Okay. So we have a map, I would say, that is increasingly trying to cover the entire territory. But it is still a representation. And a representation, by definition, excludes the thing that it represents. Any of you who carry a photograph of a loved one in your pocket know that you only look at that photograph when you're not with your loved one. A representation is about absences. I think it was Simone there. Now, there is a second genealogy we can look at very swiftly. God, how am I doing for time? The trauma of the snapshot that I mentioned at the beginning, the ripping of a moment out of the continuum of time. This happens with the invention of the box brownie just before 1900. Cinema attempted to heal that trauma by repetition. So instead of there being just one snapshot ripped, it says, well, I can emulate the flow of time by going and now, and now, and now, and now, indefinitely, and then following film with film with film. Video adds the interlace and produces inside the frame a new temporal flow as the image fills and is scanned typically from top to bottom, and in this instance on an interlace to complete the 60 half frames or 30 full frames a second on the US NTSC system. Only now, where photons and video concentrate in vast relational arrays, there is an ecology of images of the same scale and flexibility as the continuum. So the mass image puts all these images together, video and still, in order to produce a single ecological image. But the ecology which it is modeling is an ecology which is fundamentally cybernetic in the same way as the model of the free market and the model that we now have of the ecology as something homeostatic and self-equilibrating. So, for this reason alone, well, hang on, no, let me just go back one step. The mass image is a monad, in philosophical terms. The most successful attempt in history to picture the world not only excludes the world, but time, which exists only as date stamps, a coordinate position in a time-space grid. The mass image has no future. So I just have a mass image here. That's a mass image of a search for selfies. It has no future. It models the world as a homeostatic system in perfect equilibrium. It has no hope. And of course, it has no innovation. The picture that is being made has no place for innovation because it cannot clock change. It has no sense of mortality like a human. So for these reasons alone, it remains important to make art in the 21st century. And this is what I promised to do when Valentino and the organising committee invited me here, so I'll try and bring this in. Much of the self-styled art of biennales and so on is only entertainment, just a channel for supplying the mass image with the one thing that it cannot currently generate for itself, creativity. It's the one reason that human beings are still around in the era of a corporate cyborg, is that we are required to provide randomly generated creativity, which a fully planned system cannot do. So we need things like Rafael Lozano Hemmer's pulse spiral. I showed a brief video of this just before the show. The slides will be available, and this is the one of my exhibits that has a link, so that should be freely available to see the moving version of this. So the lights are arranged here in a Fermat spiral that order the hanging lamps in a return to a Platonic geometry of pure idea. Ideas become the contemporary, becoming a visualization of the contemporary belief that nature and therefore human life is wholly mathematical, and it hangs really dramatically over participants like a sword of Damocles. Sociologist of science Bruno Latour says somewhere that reality is what resists, but in data science what resists, as in pulse spiral, is the human being who finds herself at the focus of this ordered world. The joyful animation of the lights, so as you connect to a controller, it reads your pulse, and the pulse then animates the lights. So it's reading data from your pulse. The joyful animation of the lights makes me feel that I am in control and actually in the focus, because as you look up, you see this beautiful spiral formation echoing your own pulse. You believe you're in control, but even then, you're aware that what you illuminate is a structure that precedes everything that you are, logically and chronologically. And the animating force is something that you have little control over. It is your pulse. It is not something you control. It is actually the life force animating a body. So the interface is, I think, a truly critical one about the interface between two modes of the non-human, the highly technologized and the ecological mess of a human sweating, breathing body. We also need glitches. Now, for this I want to show a little clip. So, and I have to show this with the sound down. Hope this will work. This is by Bashar al-Khroub. It's made in 2010 by in Palestine. And I'm afraid I'm going to show without sound. Or with the sound down. As you can imagine, it's using very low-level equipment. Mary Douglas taught us that dirt is only matter in the wrong place. Noise is only signal in the wrong place. Averaged out, compressed, and predicted out of existence, like the Palestinian people. Bashar al-Khroub's Heavenly is made with the least expensive, least spectacular equipment. It tracks along the netting suspended above an abandoned souk that had to be installed to catch the rubbish that the Israeli settlers on the heights above throw onto the Palestinians on the ground below. The modernist grid of power, the screen itself, protects us as viewers from the detritus thrown in from elsewhere, but it is a weak barrier. The interference that occurs between the movement of the camera, the MPEG codex operations as it tries to predict those movements, and then, and the digital display that then re-encodes some of the judder, displays an inadequate protection of the video medium. Now, the political geography of Palestine is very much about power, and there's these shuddering images, and you see how the lines break up. This is a glitch. I could have used the art of Rosa Megman or many other glitch artists, but I wanted to show this because this is the process of low-grade video, lossy video, being employed in order to demonstrate some of the problems that come when you try to see the heavenly sky above Palestine. And a second exhibit, a very brief one, is, I had this open, but we'll see, is also from 2010. It's a work by Victor Bergin. It concerns the reconstruction of a villa that was destroyed an old coffee house overlooking the Bosphorus, destroyed by Erdogan when he was mayor of Istanbul, in an effort to build what is now a highly luxurious and Orientalist hotel. And Bergen talks about this, the house and garden had to be disinterred from oblivion through the agency of surviving drawings and photographs, and was resurrected as memory in the form of virtual camera movements through a computer-modeled space. In fact, in this case, a games engine. Now, one of the things that Bergen talks about is the way that this was, the destruction of this Ottoman coffee house was orchestrated through debt financing. And I want to make a last point about this, really. As the global financial crisis proved, our societies are structured by debt. Debt is money we borrow from the future to spend in the present. In the same way, when we extract what we want from the environment and dump whatever we don't want, we are also extracting goods from the future, and we're dumping our CO2 and our plastics into the future. The future has an existence, but it is excluded from the eternal present of the mass image database. That is why Bergen's work of trying to disinter the destroyed and to reconstruct it for a future is so important. It's to reconstruct an alternative mode of time to those that operate in spreadsheets, databases, geographic information systems. This is not about a simulation, it is about confronting the challenge that the future is supposed to take care of our carbon emissions. The future is supposed to eat our plastic. The future will pay our debts. In that final moment of redemption, which, as Althusser says, never comes, or as the church says, if it does come, it will come with a sword. Cyborg Corporation cannot understand that it is a suicidal operation, which undercuts its own profitability in order to generate present profit, because the present is the only time that can be the site of profit. We need our art in order to do this. I started with two pictures, a selfie and a medallion, both of them failing to picture the network they depend on, the difference between their failures. And the other failures mapped by Bergen, Lozano, Hemmer, and Alhub, that difference is history. It's also the ground where innovation must operate if it is to be more than simply the next toy, if it is actually to become not just innovation but reinvention. So thank you very much. Thanks kindly for your attention.
We probably have time for one short question if anybody is interested in commenting. Okay, in that case, since we are really short of time, I think we really have to thank our speaker again, and we move on to the next session. Thank you very much, Sean.